Maybe. There it goes. Okay, we are connected. So we talked about potential and kinetic energy, right? We didn't get to that point in this class, right? No? Not at all? Okay. Yes and no. So potential versus kinetic energy. Your textbook goes through and explains a bunch of detail. I ended up tweaking the slides ever so slightly to bring in some actual examples. So what I had been talking about before with potential energy is if you take a ball and we held that ball above someone's head, right? There's a lot of potential energy now stored up in that ball. And when I let go of it, that energy is released, okay, in the form of kinetic energy. So kinetic energy is our motion or movement. Potential energy is its stationary state, okay, what energy is inherently stored within it. Okay, if I hold that ball above someone's head, eventually that energy will then get translated into their head and they'll probably be upset at me. Okay? So that's kind of the idea behind potential and kinetic energy. It's the same kind of thing that we're seeing with mass. We can change, do a reaction and change our mass. Energy is going to do something similar. We can start with potential energy, but that energy has to go somewhere. We can't lose that potential energy. So when I let go of it, the potential energy changes into kinetic energy. So we can change where it's located, but we can't get rid of it. Okay? We take advantage of potential and kinetic energy every day. Okay? The biggest example would be something like a hydroelectric dam. What we're doing is taking advantage of the natural cycles within our planet where during a large heat, water evaporates from, say, our oceans or even from plants or other resources. That evaporation collects up in our atmosphere, typically condenses, turns into snow, and falls down on our mountains. When it hits the mountains and eventually the snow heats up enough, turns into a liquid, and starts to run down the mountains, okay? Because we have that high potential energy state. As soon as we give it the option to move, it runs downhill. Okay? So that's just the natural flow of the energy cycle with water. Okay? What we try to do as humans is take advantage of that natural flow. And that's what we're doing with hydroelectric dams. We put in a dam that now prevents or controls how that water moves from its high potential energy to its low potential energy, okay? Or low kinetic to high kinetic energy. And in the process, as the water falls down the mountain, we make it turn some turbines for us. Those turbines we translate into electrical energy. Okay? So we're taking advantage of those processes or those transitions. Okay? In that case, it's much like the ball. We're looking at a very physical change. We can also take advantage of chemical energy. Okay? And we do that every day. Most people got here using their cars. Okay? Well, the internal combustion engine is actually a very small explosion. We are exploding gasoline. Okay? And it's a little bit nicer than a bomb because we're controlling that explosion in a very organized fashion. And in that process, as it explodes, it causes a piston to move. That motion of the piston then translates into a forward motion for our car. Okay? So we are taking advantage of the chemical energy stored within the bonds of gasoline to generate motion for our car. Okay? We can take that even further. Wow, that's quiet. We can take that even further and look at how we're all existing even in this room. Okay? Just the sheer process of you sitting here is actually taking advantage of chemical energy because you're still breathing, your heart's beating, you're moving a little bit, in theory your hand's moving, okay? Your brain's thinking. For all of those individual things to happen, we have to release some form of energy. That energy, when it comes to biological things, is typically stored in something known as ATP, okay? Or released in the form of ATP. And what happens in our body is we convert ATP to ADP, and if you look really careful at those structures, the thing that's changing is this last group on the end. You'll notice we only have 2 phosphoruses down there. We have 3 phosphoruses up here. The removal of that extra phosphorus, or the breaking of that last bond, releases chemical energy. All living things have learned how to adapt that chemical energy and translate it into something useful. Okay? So for us, allowing a muscle to move, okay? Allowing our hearts to beat, allowing our minds to think. Okay? So we do take advantage of all sorts of different forms of energy every day, and most commonly it's chemical energy that we're evaluating. Okay? So the next thing is looking at kinetic energy, because we've actually seen that fairly frequently in a lot of different cases. So I said kinetic energy is relatively the same idea as motion. If we increase the amount of motion of anything, we end up increasing its kinetic energy. Right? So we could then translate that back into some chemical information we've already seen. We came up with three main types of matter, or phases for matter. We had solids, liquids, and gases. And if we go through and try and correlate the kinetic energy back to these, which of those phases likely has the most kinetic energy? The gas. It is now free-flowing and moving as we speak, okay, which is one of the reasons why we can walk through gas, because the gas can move around us. If we take a look at solids, what happens with a solid? What's the kinetic energy of our solid? How much does it move? Not at all, which is why when we attempt to walk through it, we usually end up in pain. So we end up running into that solid. Okay? So it's just an idea of trying to represent those different energy forms and tie them back to the matter and phases that we've already seen. Okay? Questions about that? Yeah?
It's a little confusing. I mean, you'd think if I throw a lead weight at you, it's going to do a lot more damage than if I threw a bunch of air. You know?
So the amount of energy translated is the next big issue. Okay? So at this point, we're only looking at the kinetic energy for an individual particle. If we now increase the amount of mass behind that particle, that's a different situation. Okay? So if we look at an individual solid atom of lead versus an individual gas atom of oxygen, okay, we got to avoid changing the mass. So let's stick with a solid atom of lead and a gas atom of lead. The gaseous atom will have more kinetic energy because it has the freedom to move. If we now start bringing into mass, now you're looking at a slightly different situation. Okay? Because now you're not comparing just energy to energy, you're also comparing mass with that, or matter along with the energy inherent in that individual atom. Okay? How would that change the system? Okay, well, I'm pretty sure we got to this. Einstein went through and said there's a relationship between energy and mass. So what happens in the case of the lead? Well, if we compare atom to atom, there's no mass difference. But now if we take a large particle of lead and we take an equal volume, say, of gas, the lead is definitely going to hurt more. Okay? And that's because there's more energy stored in it due to the mass. Okay? Physics gets into that a whole lot more. As far as what we're concerned about is that we have this relationship between energy and mass, and they must be conserved. Okay? In every single reaction, the energy is going to be conserved, and our mass is going to be conserved. Okay? That can get tricky when trying to build our reactions, because we have to make sure that we keep everything entirely enclosed. Okay? So we could just put everything in a giant box, but then how do you start a reaction if it's in a giant box? Okay, you're on the outside of that box. That makes it difficult. If you now step inside of that box to start the reaction, you've now included yourself in the reaction. That's going to complicate your experiment. Okay? So we have to be aware of what is theoretical and what is realistic. In almost every experiment, you will find it doesn't match exactly to theory. And that's because to run that experiment, we had to be present. We're now causing a shift off of the theoretical because we haven't accounted for our system, what we are doing to that system. Okay? Other questions? Okay. So different forms of energy. Okay, we already talked about some of these. We looked at potential versus kinetic, which is kind of a stored physical approach to it. We could also look at chemical, which is one of the ones that I talked about. Okay, when we're looking at gasoline or ATP. Other forms, heat is a form of energy. Light is a form of energy. Okay, how do we know that? What happens when we add heat to a solid? What happens to the kinetic energy? goes up. But remember, we can't just say it all of a sudden changes. We had to get that energy from somewhere. Where did that kinetic energy come from to move from a solid to a gas? From the heat that we had to put into that system to cause that transition. Okay, so if we're going to change from one form to another, we have to account for an equal and opposite change in one of our other forms. Light can also be used as a source of energy. Okay, how do we know that? Okay, sun kind of works. That is a source of light, but how do you know that's a source of energy? What's that? We could look at photosynthesis. Plants convert light energy into chemical reactions to make sugar. That sugar is then an energy source that we can later use. Okay, so we could look at the natural way. There's also the unnatural way. What's our unnatural way? Solar cells. Okay, another option, good call, looking at the actual light bulbs within this room. How are we getting that energy? We're pumping electrical current into the sample or into our light fixture. That electrical current is then translated into energy or light energy. Okay, we've got the electrical energy that was necessary to make the light energy in the case of our lights. We can look at mechanical. This is more like the potential and kinetic, where we're looking at physical worlds. We can also look at nuclear energy. Okay, what's happening there? We're looking at the energy stored within the very center, I guess we haven't really talked about that, but the very center of an atom. Okay? So there's lots of different forms of energy. Pretty much if you can think of any process, there was an energy transfer in some form or another. Okay? Your textbook went through, at least in the slides that they gave me, I don't remember how they phrased it in the actual text, but they were saying in chemical changes, energy is transformed from one to another. In all changes, energy is transformed from one to another. Okay? It's not just chemical. Anytime something happens, we have changed the state of our energy. We're moving from one form to another. And we have to account for those differences in energy. So in the case that they're looking at here, we're taking, I guess they're going to say water, so liquid water, and we could add electrical energy to that. Okay, it's a very common process, and in the process, or when that electrical energy is added into it, one of the results is that we can then cleave the water molecule apart into its individual pieces. And by individual pieces, I mean hydrogen gas and oxygen gas. So we can take water as a compound and split it into its elements by adding electrical energy. Okay? We could also do something else with that water. Instead of adding electrical energy, what happens when we add heat energy? We see a physical phase change. Okay? So it's a question of what we're doing as far as to the reaction. What energy are we inputting? And that does change the end results. But the energy transfers ends up being the same in each case. Okay? So realize, every reaction you do, you are changing the energy of your system, okay, or the reactants and products. Questions about that? Okay, make sure I remember right, and I do. If you have questions about anything we have covered so far? Okay, that means we get a quiz. So go ahead and put everything away. We'll do this pretty quickly. So I'm going to pass out a small sheet of paper. Get your name on that in the upper right-hand corner, followed by your question number, and then answer the question. Everybody get a sheet of paper?
What if you spell it out?
Don't worry about spelling. As long as I can figure out what you were trying to spell, we'll accept that. Remember, our exams are multiple choice.